As we did last year, I'd like to append to our reading of Lamentations some thoughts concerning one of the verses we just read. First, we bear in mind our ancient tradition that, in fact, there were thousands, if not millions, of prophets in Israel until the destruction of the first temple. But only those whose words were needed by all generations are recorded in the Bible. That means whatever we read in the Bible pertains to every one of us. Even if it's a description of some particular set of circumstances addressed to the prophet's contemporaries, there's a message to be gleaned for every set of circumstances. And those words, in some sense, pertain no less to all generations, to us as well. So it's in that light that I'd like to focus upon Lamentations chapter 1, verse 20, which concludes, abroad, outside, the sword bereaves. At home, there is the like of death. What sort of death is it that strikes at home? Perhaps we can glean the answer from Jeremiah chapter 9, verse 20. And admittedly, it has implications for the great big elephant in the room this year. For death is come up into our windows. It is entered into our palaces to cut off the infants from outside and the young men from the broad places. Speak, thus says the Lord, and the carcasses of men fall as dung upon the open field. This is not death by the sword. This is a death that strikes at home. It enters through the windows. It is airborne. It is a plague. We can well imagine that Jerusalem under siege was a hotbed for epidemics, compromised public hygiene, devastating overcrowding, and the plague felled more victims than did the sword. The carcasses of men fall as dung upon the open field. And my mind turned to the book of Samuel, tantalizingly. A book ended by plagues at its beginning and at its end. In the first book of Samuel, in chapter 5, we read, after the Philistines had taken the ark of God in battle from Israel, they bring it to their city Ashdod. And in verse 6, but the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them and smote them with emerods, archaic English for hemorrhoids. The Hebrew is obscure. It might mean hemorrhoids. Perhaps it's a plague of dysentery. Another possibility is tumors. Another, the boobs of bubonic plague. One way or another, they recognize this is because of the ark of the God of Israel. In verse 8, what shall we do with it? And they decide to send the ark to the Philistine city of Gath. In verse 9, the same scenario recurs. The hand of the Lord was against the city with a great discomfiture, and he smote the men of the city, both small and great, and emerods, hemorrhoids, tumors, boobs, broke out upon them. And eventually they realize they can't bear having the ark in their midst. Verse 11, send away the ark of the God of Israel, let it go back to its own place, let it slay us not and our people. Now they appreciate this is the cause of the plague, but is it fair? Who could expect the Philistines to understand what the significance of the holy ark of God is? And yet evidently they did understand. Because in the previous chapter, in chapter 4, when the Israelites, arrayed for battle, bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord into their camp, we read in verse 5, all Israel shouted with a great shout so that the earth rang, and the Philistine response, what means the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews? And they knew that the ark of the Lord was coming to the camp. And the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into the camp. And they said, woe unto us, for there was not such a thing yesterday and the day before. The Philistines, pagans that they are, recognize the ark of God for what it is. Indeed, everyone does. Jeremiah in chapter 10 verse 7 exclaims, who would not fear you, O King of the nations? For it befits you, for as much as among all the wise men of the nations and in all their royalty, there is none like unto you. The whole world recognizes the divinity of God. God is King of the nations. Sure, many may succumb to the allure of an illegitimate shortcut of paganism, but they still realize you are the king. And so it is that when King Solomon embarks upon building the holy temple, Gentile King Huram of Tyre exclaims, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, that made the heaven and the earth, who has given to David the king a wise son, endowed with discretion and understanding, that should build a house for the Lord. In Chronicles 2, chapter 2. And at the beginning of Ezra, chapter 1, many generations later, Gentile King Cyrus of Persia issues his proclamation, all the kingdoms of the earth has the Lord, the God of heaven, given me and has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whosoever there is among you of all his people, his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And likewise, in chapter 6, we read about the reissuance of Cyrus's proclamation by King Darius, who appends to it the mandate, let the work of this house of God alone be advanced. In chapter 7, the same by King Artaxerxes, also making a decree to provide whatever support is necessary for Ezra, the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, in order to do exactly for the house of the God of heaven as mandated. So there's this universal realization. God is God. His temple is the focal point of the world. The focal point of the temple is going to be the Holy Ark. And the Philistines, Gentiles that they are held accountable. Of course, it's not just the Philistines. Because we're turning to the book of Samuel. In Samuel 1, chapter 6, when the Philistines send back the ark, we read in verse 13, they of Beth Shemesh, the Israelites, were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark and rejoiced to see it. In verse 15, the Levites took down the ark of the Lord. The men of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrifices unto the Lord. In verse 19, he smote the men of Beth Shemesh because they had gazed upon the ark of the Lord. 70 men and 50,000 men, and the people mourned because God had smitten the people with a great slaughter, perhaps even greater than that among the Philistines. Is this the same plague as the one of the Philistines, or is it a different one? If we would be epidemiologists back in the day, in the absence of prophetic insight, we'd undoubtedly have a lot to say about the spread of disease. But the prophet tells us, for both the Philistines and for Israel, it was because of lightly esteeming the holy ark. And so it is with that message pertaining to the ark, the heart of the sanctuary, that in some sense the book of Samuel begins. Let's consider how it ends. The last chapter, Samuel 2, chapter 24. Again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. Now, conducting a head count is explicitly in violation of Exodus chapter 30, where we're warned in verse 12 that the consequence of the head count could be a plague among them. And indeed, returning to that last chapter of Samuel, Gad the seer is sent to David with the message, shall 7 years of famine come unto you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in the land? Now advise, consider what answer I shall return to him that sent me. And David said unto Gad, I am in great strait. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, and let me not fall into the hand of man. And that means the plague of pestilence. In verse 15, so the Lord sent the pestilence among Israel from the morning even to the time appointed, and there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000 men. And when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented of the evil and said to the angel who destroyed the people, it is enough. Now stay your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Aravnah the Jebusite. And there's some additional elaboration in the verse that follows. David, in seeing this apparition of the angel, prays to God that the plague be withdrawn. In verse 18, Gad came that day to David and said unto him, go up, rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Aravnah the Jebusite. And this is a description of David coming to Aravnah, offering to buy the threshing floor. Aravnah says, I'm giving it to you as a gift. David demurs and insists upon buying the threshing floor. And the very last verse of the book of Samuel, verse 25, and David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel. And we ask, almost in horror, this is the end of the book of Samuel? What a denouement. It's not even at the end of the life of King David. He's still with us at the beginning of the book of Kings. Why here? We get some additional detail with respect to this narrative in the corresponding version of the story in the first book of Chronicles in chapter 21, where there are a number of additional details. We'll just focus upon one critical one. In verse 16 there we read, this apparition of the angel, David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between the earth and the heaven, having a drawn sword in his hand stretched out over Jerusalem. And that's when David and the elders fall upon their faces and David prays. And we ask, what spot is there on all the earth where you could be standing between the earth and the heaven? And the answer, of course, is that's the spot upon which the temple is going to be built. And so when Gad the seer tells David to erect an altar there, and we read in verse 26, David built there an altar unto the Lord, and God answered him from heaven by fire upon the altar of burnt offering. We know the significance of the place. At the beginning of chapter 22, David said, this is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel. And a few chapters later, in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 1, then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem in Mount Moriah, where the Lord appeared unto David his father, for which provision had been made in the place of David in the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. This is the site of the Holy Temple. What's the final note of the book of Samuel? The location of the Holy Temple is here, designated. But returning to the plague, one can't help but wonder what is going on in this terrifying tale. In particular, the enigmatic opening verse, again, the last chapter of Samuel, verse 1. And again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. Tantalizingly, terrifyingly. It's not simply that there is a punishment for conducting the census. The census itself was punishment for something else. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. The text does not tell us why. We have an ancient tradition that seeks the answer precisely in the narrative that then ensues. Finding the place for the temple to be built. We should have been looking for it. We should have been yearning for it. Israel, the world, should have been yearning for the Holy Temple. But no one was. The only one who strove to build the Holy Temple was, ironically, David himself. But he was disqualified because he had shed blood in battle. He was not the one designated to build this house of universal peace and brotherhood. But where was everyone else? No one was looking. And so, the spot designated for the erection of the Holy Temple was revealed through a devastating plague because no one was looking for it before. And we consider this message then emergent from the bookends of the book of Samuel. At the beginning of the book of Samuel, the Israelites and the Philistines are smitten by a plague because they aren't relating with sufficient deference to the Holy Ark, the focal point, the heart of the Holy Temple. And at the end of the book of Samuel, Israel is again smitten by a plague because they aren't looking for the temple. All about getting ready for what in some sense is the critical message of the book of Kings, the building of a temple to God. Now, it's important for us to stress, building a temple for God is not because God needs a house. As King Solomon expresses it in the first book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 27, in his prayer of dedication of the Holy Temple, "Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that I have built." But as God expresses it, when he commands us to build a sanctuary in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell, not in it, that I may dwell among them." To be able to sense God's immanence, to be conscious, manifestly, viscerally, of God's presence in the world. That's a game changer for this broken world in which we live. Now, the cynics may say, we have a lot more important things to worry about. A lot of other things that are lacking in the world. To which we respond, they're all because we don't adequately sense God's presence in the world, because the Holy Temple is missing. In Isaiah chapter 11, we read about that blessed day when the Messiah comes and the Holy Temple is restored. Verse 9, "They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the seabed." No more strife. A world at peace. No one hurting, no one destroying. And the wellspring of that peace and brotherhood is God's holy mountain, the restored Holy Temple, through which knowledge of God fills the earth as waters cover the seabed. That, more than anything else, is what we need to heal the world today. Now, it's important for me to stress two critical caveats. Number one, no one is coming to offer some facile explanation of the pandemic today or of any epidemic other than the ones about which we read explicitly in the book of Samuel. Then there was a prophet to tell us exactly what's going on. We don't have such a prophet today. We don't know. But the message is still a message for us. The message, to what extent are we yearning for God's restored house on earth? For the heart of the world that is missing to be restored to her. Second caveat, I'll express by way of a short story. As undoubtedly many of you know, in 1929, the land of Israel was torn asunder by a wave of murderous pogroms against the Jewish community. The Jewish community in Hebron suffered scores of fatalities, people who were hacked to death ruthlessly by the mob. The Jewish community of Gaza was practically entirely destroyed and uprooted. And in the wake of all of these pogroms, all of these atrocities, the British, who had the mandate over the land of Israel by dint of the League of Nations, convened a commission of inquiry to determine whether the appropriate response to all the massacres was to deny the Jews the right to pray at the Western Wall. Well, if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's a good sign. But remember, this is before appeasement had gotten its well-deserved bad name. And reportedly, the chief rabbi in the land of Israel, Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Cook, was called to testify before the commission. And one of the commissioners challenged him menacingly, "Isn't it true that you Jews want to build your temple where the Muslims have their mosques?" And the rabbi calmly replied, "When it is time for the temple of God to be restored, the Muslims will be running ahead of us to disassemble their mosques, to make way for God's house restored." It's not just a brilliant response, it's the truth. Because we earnestly believe if the nations would have appreciated what the temple signified for them, as the Midrash expresses it, they would have surrounded it by legions to protect it. And on that note, I'd like to conclude as I did last year with the second verse of Lamentations. Now, as we noted last year, you can't really translate the beginning of the verse. Bachot tivket balayla. It's a rare conjugation by doubling of the verb that only exists in biblical Hebrew, not in post-biblical Hebrew. It doesn't carry over into English. We could say, Jerusalem weeps, weeping into the night. Doesn't really make sense in English that way. But this double verb elicits the quest by the Midrash to determine who else is weeping besides Jerusalem. There are a number of answers. The one that's germane for our purposes is, she is weeping, and the nations of the world are weeping with her. Now, the cynics might retort, what? The nations of the world? Weren't they the ones who destroyed her? As all those who are in the business of bridge building can well appreciate, don't make the mistake of painting everyone with one brush. There were those who were destroying. There were others who were weeping. But at the time, except by Jeremiah's hypersensitive prophetic ears, those cries went unheard. We hear them now. Jews and Gentiles together, weeping for the destruction. Gazing at Jerusalem, even as it bursts forth today, with its heart, the Holy Temple, still missing. The heart of the world, still missing. That world of universal peace and brotherhood. A world without strife, still so woefully elusive a goal. And we consider this message from Lamentations and from Samuel as a challenge to us. To what extent are we pining for the restoration of God's house? To what extent do we miss having God's presence in our midst? And with that, we redouble ourselves in prayer. The final prayerful note of the book of Lamentations. Chapter 5, verse 21. Return you us unto you, O Lord, and we shall be returned. Renew our days as of old. Amen.